On November 15th, 1891, Jo van Gogh-Bonger sits down to write in her diary for the first time in 3 years. The last entry was written just before her wedding to Theo van Gogh, brother to Vincent. Since then, she's been married and widowed, moved from the Netherlands to Paris and back again, and given birth to a son. She writes, quote, "What lies behind me, my short, blissful marital happiness, that too has been a dream. For a year and a half, I was the happiest woman on earth. It was a long, beautiful, wonderful dream, the most beautiful one can dream. And following it was all that untold suffering. I lost him, my dear, faithful husband, who made my life so rich, so full, who awakened everything that was good in me." End quote. Then she writes something that will change art history. Quote, "As well as the child, he has left me another task, Vincent's work, getting it seen and appreciated as much as possible. That, too, is my work." End quote. Jo had spent her youth feeling like she'd never be the writer she dreamed of becoming, constantly berating herself for falling short of her own very high expectations. So when Theo died after just 21 months of marriage, leaving her with a baby and hundreds of paintings no one really wanted, she found an outlet for all of that unfulfilled creative ambition. She would honor Theo's greatest wish, making Vincent van Gogh immortal. In the process, the art world would dismiss her as a grieving amateur with no credentials, no connections, and no idea what she was doing. They were somewhat right. She had no formal training, but that's part of why she was so successful. Jo saw herself as one of the ordinary people Vincent had wanted to reach, which meant she understood something that the male dealers and critics didn't. Vincent's suffering wasn't separate from his genius. It was the key to understanding his genius. And by eventually publishing his letters alongside promoting the paintings, she fused the tragic life story with the art in a way that had never been done before. She was keeping alive those 21 electric months with Theo, that period where she vaulted out of her careful, conventional world and gave herself over to passion, art, and possibility. In devoting 35 years to Vincent's legacy, she was preserving the most intense experience of her own life. And in doing so, she accidentally invented one of the most embedded modern conceptions of what an artist should be. Tortured, misunderstood, creating transcendent work through suffering. So every time you think of a struggling artist, you have Jo van Gogh-Bonger partly to thank for that. She helped make that myth, and that myth would shape modern art in many ways. I'm Emma Laramie, and this is Verso. Jo was born Johanna Bonger on October 4th, 1862 in Amsterdam into a solidly middle-class Dutch family. Her childhood was, by most measures, a happy one. Her father, Hendrik, was sober and pious and emotionally aloof, but her family was close-knit, and her parents fostered a sense of cultural appreciation in their children by providing them with piano lessons, books, and trips to the theater. Jo was short, at barely 5'3" tall, with dark brown hair and eyes and a round face. But it was her mind that defined her. She was deeply intelligent, introspective, and devastatingly hard on herself. Her diary entries from her teenage years and early 20s read like a litany of self-criticism. She's always falling short, always failing to live up to her own impossible standards. Like in November 1885, when she wrote, quote, I would like to write, but I don't have the desire. Shall I ever actually be able to achieve something good? End quote. And a year later, when she said, quote, yet I have nothing special to report, always the same old song, dissatisfied with myself. And this time I have good reason. I've been more selfish than ever recently, indifferent, unfriendly to everyone at home. I'm not achieving anything, frittering away my time. I have no objective in mind. Things must change. But how? End quote. This unfulfilled creative ambition to be a writer sits inside of her like a stone. But she's voracious. She's reading constantly, learning French, German, and English. And she works as an English teacher and translator throughout the Netherlands in her youth. It's respectable work, solid, middle-class work. But it's not the creative life she dreams of. What Jo doesn't know yet is that this ache to create something meaningful will find its outlet in the most unexpected way. Not through her own work, but through someone else's. Because in the summer of 1885, Jo's brother Andries, who's been working as an art dealer in Paris, brings home a pale, soulful friend named Theo van Gogh. The three of them go to the Rijksmuseum together, the grand new museum that has opened just across from where Jo's family used to live. The magnitude of the building leaves an impression on her. Having her dear brother home leaves an impression. But Theo? Not so much. She barely mentions him in her diary. Theo, on the other hand, is completely taken with her. After only 2 meetings, he does something bold. He shows up at her house unannounced and proposes. Jo is shocked, partly because of how sudden it feels, partly because roses from Edward Stumpf, the man she's currently in love with, are sitting on the table nearby. So she says no. But in her diary that night, she writes something revealing. Quote, what he conjured up for me was the ideal that I've always dreamed of. A rich life, full of variety, full of food for the mind, a circle of people around us who wish us well, who want to do something in the world, end quote. And her rejection doesn't deter Theo. He goes back to Paris and immediately writes to her. He tells her that they have so much in common. He tells her about his work as a dealer, about the modern artists he represents. And he tells her at length about his brother Vincent and their close bond. He spends a year and a half writing passionate letters about art and life and possibility. And slowly, Jo starts to see it. Then finally, in December 1888, she says yes. But before they can begin planning the wedding, Vincent cuts off his ear. So Theo rushes to the south of France to help his brother. Although he kept the details from her at first, Theo eventually writes to Jo from Arles, telling her everything about Vincent's breakdown and his fear that his brother might be deranged forever, the depth of his attachment to Vincent and how he feels responsible for him, how he knows he can't abandon him. And Jo, reading these letters, falls in love not just with Theo, but with his devotion to his brother. So she writes back, quote, you had often talked about him, about how much you loved him. But now I know what you mean, and realize what an influence he must have had on your life. It reflects such a noble, lofty spirit. His letter has made my longing to get to know him and love him much, much stronger. Shall I ever be able to do anything for him when we are married? I'm afraid he'll see me as a nuisance, end quote. Despite the false start, Jo and Theo marry on April 18th, 1889. Vincent doesn't attend the wedding because he's still recuperating in Arles. Immediately, the newlyweds settle into a modest apartment on Paris's Cité Pigalle. And soon, every wall, nook, and cranny is covered in Vincent's paintings. Under the bed, under the sofa, in the cupboards, in spare rooms, there's canvases everywhere. violent yellows, churning blues, and thick, aggressive brushstrokes that seem to vibrate with intensity. Jo, thankfully for history, likes them, because if she hadn't, we likely wouldn't know the name Vincent van Gogh today. Theo brings home artists and dealers, and Jo sits back and listens to them discuss things like color theory and technique and what modern art should be. She feels out of her depth, insecure about her French, uncertain about her ability to keep up with these conversations about art. But something starts to shift. Theo explains to her how he sees the paintings, how Vincent is trying to capture not just what things look like, but what they feel like. And slowly, Jo starts to come alive. And for 21 months, Jo lives in this electric atmosphere. She and Theo are, for the most part, happy, although, like any marriage, it wasn't without its struggles. She doesn't know it yet, but this will be the most important time of her life. Not just because she's happy, but because everything she's learning, she's going to need. 1890 starts off on a high note. On January 31st, Jo gives birth to a son. They name him Vincent. The pregnancy had been difficult. Jo had written to her brother-in-law, terrified she wouldn't survive the labor. And Theo's health was quietly failing. He was constantly coughing and shivering and was so fragile he'd been denied life insurance. Jo had seen that rejection as an annoyance for her husband, not understanding what a precarious position this put her in. But the baby lifts their spirits, and in May, they feel well enough to travel to Amsterdam to show off little Vincent to the family. Then the summer arrives, and everything falls apart. In early July 1890, Vincent is staying with them in Paris. At some point during this visit, a conversation starts about Theo's plan to leave his current gallery and start his own business with Jo's brother Andries. The details of this conversation are lost to history, but we know that tensions rise. Andries keeps backing out and then agreeing again. Vincent worries about what this will mean for the financial support Theo sends him. Money gets discussed, futures get discussed, and the practicalities of leaving a stable job to take a risk get discussed. And Vincent, already fragile, already exhausted, can't handle it. He leaves for Auvers, where he's recently been living, overtired and stressed. And from the moment this happens, Jo wonders to Theo, could I have been kinder to Vincent? Should I have said something different? And she would question her choice of words for many years after, because 3 weeks later, Vincent shoots himself. And he dies 2 days after that, with Theo by his side. Jo doesn't learn the full scope of what had happened until days afterwards. And when she does, she's devastated, saying, quote, "Oh, how I should have liked to see him again and say how sorry I was for having been impatient with him the last time. I would do anything, if only I could, to make up for his loss," end quote. If Jo is devastated, Theo is destroyed. But he channels his grief into determination, knowing he would never be able to forgive himself if he didn't do everything in his power to convince the world of Vincent's mastery of art. Shortly after Vincent's death, he stages a show of his work in their apartment, because no gallery will take it. People come, but they're not ready for it. One observer writes that Vincent's art is, quote, "the expression of a sick mind," end quote. But Theo is running out of time. The stress and the grief accelerate the worsening condition of the syphilis he contracted years before Jo met him. And by October of 1890, he's so sick he's admitted to a nursing home. And then 2 days later, he's transferred to a mental asylum. By October 17th, he's completely lost control, lashing out at attendants, threatening to kill people, including Jo and his baby. He's forgotten how to speak French, and when he's transferred to a hospital in the Netherlands, he has to travel in a straitjacket. But Jo fights for him. She argues with doctors. She brings in a hypnotist. She tries to bring him home, but nothing works. When she visits, he speaks gibberish and knocks over furniture. She sends him flowers, and he tramples them. After months of suffering, on January 25th, 1891, Theo dies at the age of 33. Jo is 28 years old. She's been married for 21 months, and she has a baby who is just shy of a year old. She now has no income, no financial support, and hundreds of paintings that almost no one wants. She returns to the Netherlands, a widow. Jo's first decision will set everything else in motion. Emile Bernard, one of Vincent's artist friends, tells her to leave the paintings in Paris. It's the better market, he argues, and he'll help her sell them gradually. But Jo's instincts say that that's the wrong move. So she sticks to her guns, packs up the hundreds of canvases and drawings, and takes them back to the Netherlands with her. It's the first of many times that the male-dominated art establishment questions her decision-making abilities. But it's not the last time that following her instincts proves to be exactly the right call. Jo and baby Vincent settle in Bussum, a small town 18 miles southeast of Amsterdam. It's home to writers and artists and progressive thinkers who will become her friends and eventually her allies in navigating the art world. There, Jo opens a boarding house, which is a common path for middle-class widows who need income at the time. But Jo's boarding house is special because she hangs Vincent's paintings everywhere. The Potato Eaters, one of Vincent's earliest masterpieces, looms over the fireplace. Sunflowers blaze in the bedrooms. Landscapes hang in the dining room and hallways. And over time, Jo learns to stand on her own again. At first, it's overwhelming. She writes in her diary about the appalling months of Theo's illness, about struggling to recover any appetite for life. She is grieving, exhausted, and terrified. But gradually, she starts to find structure. She runs the boarding house and cares for Vincent, and she throws herself into understanding what Theo and Vincent left behind. She gives herself a crash course in art criticism, devouring the Belgian journal L'Art Moderne, a progressive publication arguing that art should serve political causes, that it should belong to ordinary people, not just the wealthy elite. This aligns perfectly with Jo's own socialist convictions. And she pores over the letters the brothers sent each other. Well, mostly the letters Vincent sent to Theo, because Vincent didn't keep nearly as many of Theo's letters. At first, she's doing it just as a way to feel close to Theo again. Jo reads them compulsively, trying to hear Theo's voice and Vincent's words. But as she reads and rereads them, trying to organize them chronologically, something else emerges. She starts to see Vincent with total clarity. The paintings aren't just paintings. They're attempts to communicate something urgent and essential. And the letters explain exactly what that something is. And then she realizes these letters are the key. If people could read them, they would understand. They would see that the violence in the brushstrokes isn't chaos, it's passion. That the intensity isn't madness, but clarity. That Vincent's suffering and his genius are kind of inseparable. So she makes a decision. She's going to publish every letter in as many languages as possible. It will take the rest of her life, but eventually she will get her wish. Once Jo has her feet under her in Bussum, she starts carefully seeking out assistance in promoting Vincent's work. The first man she approaches is Jan Veth, a critic married to her good friend Anna. Veth is outspoken against academic art, part of a progressive circle that believes art should challenge the establishment, but that doesn't mean he understands Van Gogh. Veth is, quote, repelled by the raw violence of Vincent's paintings. He finds them nearly vulgar. So Jo does something strategic. She sends him an envelope full of Vincent's letters. and it works. Slowly, Veth comes around. He writes that he now sees, quote, the astonishing clairvoyance of great humility. Once having grasped his beauty, I can accept the whole man, end quote. It's proof that Yo's instinct is right, and she'll do this time and time again to slowly break down audiences' and critics' walls, allowing them to see Vincent in totality. And the timing is ripe for people to see Vincent in this way, because in the 1890s, there's a cultural shift happening, a turn towards ideas focusing on socialism or mysticism, and sometimes both. And Jo recognizes that Vincent's work straddles these worlds. Simultaneously, Jo starts pounding the pavement, trying to get Vincent's work exhibited. Small ones at first in the Netherlands. And while leading this charge, she's learning how the art world works, how galleries operate, how to price things, how to negotiate with dealers who assume a widow knows nothing about business. And they do assume that, constantly. Her brother Andries is furious that she's making decisions without consulting him. He thought he'd be managing Vincent's estate, and he's embarrassed that he has to ask his little sister for permission to sell a painting. Other men are even more dismissive. The artist Richard Roland Holst, who will eventually help her significantly, writes about her with dripping condescension, saying, quote, Mrs. Van Gogh is a charming little woman, but it irritates me when someone enthuses fanatically over something about which she understands nothing and, blinded by sentimentality, nevertheless believes she can be purely critical. It is schoolgirl drivel, that's all. She forgets that her grief makes Vincent into a god, end quote. But Jo doesn't let these doubts get to her too much. Although she does go through moments of doubt and uncertainty, there is something remarkable in the way she continually holds fast to her instincts. In hindsight, we can see that her grief is what makes her effective. She's not approaching Vincent's work as a dispassionate critic, but she's approaching it as someone who loved the two people who believed in this art more than anything. She's someone who feels responsible for making sure Vincent's vision reaches the audience he wanted. And her lack of formal training? That turns out to be an advantage, not a weakness. She sees the paintings the way ordinary people see them. The dealers and critics have too much invested in their own expertise to admit when they're wrong. But Jo has nothing to prove except that Vincent matters. She starts becoming increasingly comfortable with the mechanics of the art market. Don't flood the market with too many works at once. Release them gradually. When you exhibit works, include some of the best paintings you have that aren't for sale to entice buyers to buy the ones that are. She learns to hold firm on pricing, even when dealers try to lowball her. She learns when to make strategic concessions, like selling to museums at a discounted price because institutional validation will drive all the other prices up. And she keeps working on publishing the letters. In 1893, the first excerpts are published in Mercure de France, a prestigious French art journal. Finally, people can start to read about Vincent's struggles, his dedication, and his vision. Then they look at these paintings with new eyes. And the snowball starts rolling. By the mid-1890s, things are starting to shift. Jo doesn't have to knock on every door anymore. Dealers are starting to come to her. A good example of this is in 1895, when Ambroise Vollard, one of the most important dealers of contemporary art in Paris, writes to Jo asking if she'll lend paintings to a group exhibition. She agrees enthusiastically. But Vollard is shrewd and slippery. He starts buying Van Goghs from other sources, such as the people who had traded works with Vincent in his lifetime, and those are people who will sell cheaper than Jo. When he does sell Jo's paintings, he drags out the payment, and eventually he sends her a check that can only be cashed in Paris, even though he knows full well that she's been living in the Netherlands for years. It's a power move, a way of making things difficult for the widow who won't just accept whatever he offers. But Jo holds her ground. She'll work with Vollard when it serves her purposes, but she won't let him control the market. Meanwhile, the letters are doing their work. More and more people are reading Vincent's descriptions of his paintings, his explanations of what he was trying to achieve. And they're starting to see him the way Jo sees him, as a visionary ahead of his time, a man who suffered for his art and created transcendent beauty from that suffering. But although the tide was turning, the court of public opinion was not firmly in Van Gogh's favor just yet. But by the turn of the 20th century, that would change. The Museum Boijmans in Rotterdam becomes the first museum in the world to own a Van Gogh. And it happens because 26 enthusiastic supporters of Vincent's work decide to pool their money together to allow the museum to make the purchase. Jo contributes to this fund. She understands that institutional validation matters. And once museums start collecting Vincent's work, his reputation will be secured. And then in 1905, Jo organizes what is still to this day the largest solo exhibition of Van Gogh's work ever mounted. It contained 484 pieces, all hanging together in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. She does everything herself. She pays to rent the galleries, she chooses which works to include, she handles the shipping, carefully packing hundreds of fragile canvases, making sure they arrive safely. She helps design the advertisements and compile the invitation list. It's an enormous undertaking, but it works. Critics come from across Europe. The Dutch public turns out in force. And in the months after the exhibition closes, Van Gogh's prices double, then triple. And as his prices rise, Jo is thinking strategically about how to keep Vincent's work accessible to ordinary people, the audience he always wanted. So she starts authorizing reproductions, cheap prints that working-class families can afford, and people buy them in droves. By 1914, Jo has been at this for 23 years. Vincent is well established in Europe. His prices are high and they are continuing to grow. His reputation in Europe is secure. But the letters still have not been published in their entirety. She's been working on this project for years, organizing them chronologically, translating them from Dutch into French and into German, painstakingly transcribing every word. And then finally that year, a comprehensive book of the letters is published. It's not quite complete because Jo has edited out things she finds boring or embarrassing, but it's the most thorough collection anyone has yet seen. And the timing is perfect. World War I has just begun, and people are hungry for beauty, for things that feel precious. The letters, with their vulnerability and intensity, give them that. What comes out of this is not only further acceptance of Van Gogh's work, but a cementing of his reputation as the archetypal tortured genius. In many ways, people today still look to Van Gogh as the playbook for this kind of artistic approach. But Jo still can't rest, because there's one market she hasn't yet cracked: America. In 1916, at the age of 54, Jo moves to New York. Her son Vincent and his new wife have just moved there, and as she's getting older, it makes sense for her to be there on both personal and professional grounds. She brings a small number of paintings with her. World War I makes shipping art across the Atlantic too risky because German U-boats are sinking ships, and Jo won't risk Vincent's work ending up at the bottom of the ocean. But she networks relentlessly. She meets collectors, curators, and critics. She works on translating the letters into English. The American market is slow to catch on, but Jo is patient. She knows the letters will work their magic here too. The war helps in an unexpected way. After the devastation of World War I, people are more receptive to art about fragility, about beauty emerging from darkness. Vincent's paintings suddenly make sense to audiences who might have found them too intense before. Jo returns to Europe in 1919. By this point, she's still working on getting the letters published into English, but her work in America is underway. And then in 1924, Jo makes a decision that breaks her heart. The National Gallery in London wants one of Vincent's sunflowers. By this point, the sunflowers are already his most prized work, and the flower has become synonymous with the artist. But the one they want is one of the paintings she swore she would never sell, one of the masterpieces she had been holding back and enjoying for herself all of these years. But the National Gallery is the most important museum in England, and having a Van Gogh there will secure his legacy in a way no private collection could. The UK market was, like America, slow to warm to Vincent, so she knew the power this acquisition had. So Jo lets them buy the painting. By the time this happens, she is 62 years old. Her health is failing because Parkinson's disease is slowly claiming her body. She can no longer write her own letters and has to hire a secretary to transcribe them for her. But she makes this final strategic move. Jo dies at age 63 on September 2nd, 1925. A collection of the letters translated into English will eventually be published a couple of years after her death. But by the time of her death, she has organized over 100 exhibitions. She's placed hundreds of Vincent's paintings and drawings in major museums and private collections across Europe and America. She's published his letters and made his story inseparable from his work. And she's authorized reproductions that brought his work into countless ordinary homes. And she, although perhaps inadvertently, invented the template for the modern artist: the suffering genius, the misunderstood visionary, the outsider who creates beauty the establishment can't comprehend. The archetype of Van Gogh seems obvious now. We're so used to reading artist biographies, watching documentaries about troubled painters, and understanding artwork through the lens of the creator's psychology that it seems surprising there was a time where a critic or a viewer wouldn't dream of thinking about the artist as a person in relation to their work. But Jo normalized this approach. Throughout much of history, artists were seen as craftsmen. They were court painters, members of guilds, people who learned techniques and applied them. Their personal lives were largely irrelevant to how their work was understood. It was only around the time of Vincent van Gogh that artists were able to break free of the patronage model and start to paint for themselves, based on their own ideas and their own feelings and desires. So many struggling artist narratives come from Jo allowing us to see Vincent for who he really was. And I think what's particularly impactful about this is that it wasn't cynical marketing. She really did find reading the letters helpful for her own understanding of her brother-in-law's paintings, and so she figured other people would have the same experience. It was as simple as that. Jo's strategy of authorizing cheap reproductions, of pushing museums to acquire works so that the public could see them, of publishing the letters so that anyone could understand Vincent's vision. All of this served both the artistic mission and her political beliefs. And she made brilliant business decisions that the quote-unquote experts told her were wrong. She held back the best paintings instead of selling everything immediately. She refused to let dealers varnish or over-restore the canvases, even when they insisted it would make them more marketable. She controlled the pace of sales to avoid flooding the market and set prices that dealers said were too high, then proved them wrong when collectors paid that anyway. And she did all of this while being constantly undermined. Men who assumed a widow couldn't possibly understand art or business. Men who thought her attachment to Vincent's work was just sentimental grief. But Jo's sentimentality was her strength. In honoring the two people she loved the most according to her own instincts, she was making right the guilt she carried about Vincent dying while they were on bad terms. But there is a cost to this legacy that's worth examining. Jo spent 35 years of her life devoting them to dead men. Her unfulfilled ambition to be a writer found its outlet not in her own creative work, but in promoting someone else's. She did remarry, but it wasn't successful. Her second marriage to Johann Cohen Gottschalk was largely unhappy, marked by his own mental illness and long absences. She dedicated everything to the two Vincents and to Theo. In one letter late in her life, she admitted, quote, "When I think about all these things, I feel a grudge against Vincent, because he is the one who took my happiness," end quote. She knew that in the intense bond between Theo and Vincent, she came second. And that inevitably affected her marriage. But she mostly kept that bitterness to herself. The public Jo was devoted entirely to Vincent's memory. And here's the bittersweet irony. Jo succeeded beyond measure. Vincent van Gogh is one of the most famous artists in history. His paintings sell for hundreds of millions of dollars, and his life story is known worldwide. But most people don't know Jo's name. We care more about Vincent's life than his afterlife. We're fascinated by the tortured genius who cut off his ear, who painted in a frenzy, and who shot himself in a wheat field. We're less interested in the widow who spent decades carefully constructing that narrative. So in some ways, Jo's story has been overshadowed by the very myth she created. After Jo died, her son Vincent took up the mantle of maintaining the Van Gogh legacy. Not that he much wanted it. So he came up with an idea. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam opened in 1973, nearly 50 years after Jo's death. It houses the paintings she couldn't bear to part with, the ones she kept close, the ones that reminded her of those 21 months in Paris when she gave herself over to passion and possibility. In selling these works to the Dutch government, the younger Vincent made his namesake available to all in perpetuity, exactly as his mother would have wanted. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by me, Emma Laramie. If you enjoyed this story, if something here surprised you, made you think differently, or just gave you something interesting to talk about over drinks with friends, do me a favor. Follow the show. Leave a rating or a review if you're feeling generous. And if there's an artist or a moment in art history you're curious about, drop a comment below. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.